Denzel Washington, Hollywood's moral compass, steps into Jimmy Kimmel's glittering arena to promote his latest film. But what begins as a simple press obligation erupts into a legendary confrontation that ends with security escorting the two-time Oscar winner from the building. How does a man of unshakable principles clash so spectacularly with late-night television's golden boy? Buckle up, because this story cuts deep. The Jimmy Kimmel live studio hums with pre-show electricity, cameras positioned like sleeping predators, lights suspended overhead ready to blaze. It's 30 minutes to air, and the building itself seems to vibrate with anticipation. Tonight's guest is Denzel Washington, here to discuss his new film about redemption and faith in urban America, a passion project that took him 7 years to bring to screen. In the green room, Denzel sits with his coffee growing cold, watching the monitor as Jimmy runs through his monologue rehearsal. His longtime manager, Patricia, paces behind him, her heels clicking against polished concrete. She's been by his side for 23 years, through every triumph and controversy, and her instincts are razor sharp. "They want you to do a segment," she says, not for the first time. "Something about acting out scenes from your old movies. The producers are calling it Denzel's greatest hits." Denzel's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. He's here because the studio insisted on promotion, because box office numbers matter, because even legends must feed the machine. But he didn't spend 7 years crafting a story about second chances and spiritual awakening to watch it reduced to party tricks. "I told them no," Patricia continues, her voice dropping lower. "But they're persistent. That young producer, Marcus, keeps circling back with fun ideas." She uses air quotes, her distaste evident. On the monitor, Jimmy's practicing a bit about celebrity social media meltdowns, his voice carrying the easy rhythm of a man who's never met a sacred cow he wouldn't milk for laughs. Denzel studies the host's face, reading the calculation behind the charm. "They think I'm here to dance," he says quietly, his voice carrying that familiar gravitas that's commanded respect for decades. His fingers drum once against his knee, a subtle tell that Patricia recognizes as gathering storm clouds. She stops pacing, meeting his eyes in the monitor's reflection. "They have no idea what they're dealing with, do they?" Denzel's smile doesn't reach his eyes. "No, they don't." The knock on the green room door comes 20 minutes before air. Marcus Chen bounds in like an eager puppy, all polished enthusiasm and clipboard energy. He's maybe 28, with the kind of aggressive optimism that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. His smile could power the studio grid. "Mr. Washington, Patricia." He extends his hand like he's greeting old friends. "I'm Marcus, senior segment producer. We are so pumped to have you tonight." Patricia's handshake is brief, professional. Denzel doesn't move from his chair, offering only a nod that could be mistaken for courtesy if you weren't paying attention to his eyes. "So I've got some killer ideas," Marcus continues, consulting his clipboard with theatrical flair. "We're thinking a little Denzel through the decades segment. You know, recreate some iconic moments. Maybe the King Kong ain't got nothing on me scene. The audience would lose their minds." The temperature in the room drops several degrees. Denzel's coffee cup finds the side table with deliberate precision. "The film we're here to discuss," Denzel says, his voice carrying the weight of distant thunder, "is about a man finding God in Compton, about redemption through faith, about hope where hope doesn't exist." Marcus's smile never wavers. "Right, totally. Heavy stuff. That's exactly why we need to balance it out with something lighter. Show your range, you know? We could even do a quick cooking segment. Cooking with Denzel." "Patricia mentioned you love to cook." Patricia's jaw clenches. "She mentioned no such thing." Or, Marcus forges ahead, consulting his notes, "We recreate the training scene from Training Day, but with Jimmy as the rookie. Comedy gold, right?" The silence stretches like a wire under tension. Denzel rises slowly, his full presence filling the small room. When he speaks, his voice is quiet, controlled, but every word carries seismic weight. "That film," he says, "is about a corrupt cop destroying everything he touches. You want to use it for comedy gold." Marcus blinks, finally, sensing he's stepped into quicksand. "Well, when you put it like that, there's no other way to put it." Denzel moves to the window overlooking the stage, where Jimmy's warming up the crowd with jokes about celebrity fashion disasters. This is what you think I am? A dancing bear for your circus? Patricia steps closer to Marcus, her voice low, urgent. You need to understand something. He's not like other guests. He doesn't play games. Marcus glances between them, his confidence cracking. We just want the audience to have fun. Fun, Denzel repeats, watching Jimmy through the glass. At whose expense? The stage manager's voice crackles through the backstage speakers. 5 minutes to Mr. Washington's entrance. The words slice through corridor chatter like a blade. Denzel adjusts his jacket, charcoal grey, impeccably tailored, and begins the walk that will change everything. The backstage maze of Jimmy Kimmel Live feels like a labyrinth of cables and ambition. Sound technicians huddle over mixing boards, their faces bathed in blue monitor light. A production assistant clutches her clipboard like a life preserver, checking and rechecking the segment rundown. Everyone moves with the choreographed urgency of live television, but Denzel moves different, slower, more deliberate, like a man walking to meet his destiny. Patricia falls into step beside him, her heels sharp against concrete. Remember, she whispers, you're here for the film. Nothing else matters. But as they round the corner toward the stage entrance, Jimmy's voice bleeds through the sound monitors, crystal clear and impossibly loud. He's deep into his monologue, working the crowd with practiced ease. So this new religious movie trend, Jimmy says, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. Apparently every actor in Hollywood is finding God now. Must be nice to have a direct line upstairs. Hey God, can you help me win an Oscar? I promise to thank you in my speech. The audience erupts in laughter. Denzel stops walking. And don't you love how these faith-based films always end? Jimmy continues, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. Everything's terrible, then someone prays really hard and suddenly miracle. The dead rise, the sick are healed, and somehow the mortgage gets paid. If only real life worked that way, right, folks? More laughter, louder now. A few whoops from the crowd. Denzel's hands curl into fists at his sides. Patricia touches his arm, a gentle warning, but he's already somewhere else. 7 years of his life condensed into a punchline. 7 years of conversations with pastors and community leaders, of studying scripture, of trying to capture something sacred on film, reduced to fodder for cheap laughs. Oh, and get this, Jimmy adds, building to his crescendo. They always cast serious dramatic actors in these things, like that makes them more believable. Because nothing says authentic faith like someone who's made millions pretending to be other people for a living. The stage manager taps his headset. Mr. Washington, we're ready for you. Denzel looks toward the stage entrance where Jimmy's silhouette moves behind the curtain, still milking the religious movie bit for every laugh. The host has no idea what's coming, no idea that the man he's mocking is standing 20 feet away, listening to every word. Sir? The stage manager prompts. Denzel straightens his shoulders, his jaw set like granite. When he speaks, his voice is quiet, measured, but it carries the weight of imminent reckoning. I'm ready, he says, but ready for what, exactly, remains to be. Scene. The studio lights blaze like interrogation lamps as Denzel emerges from behind the curtain. The audience erupts, 300 voices becoming one thunderous roar of recognition and reverence. He moves across the stage with that distinctive stride, unhurried but purposeful, each step deliberate as a chess move. Jimmy bounds up from behind his desk, arms spread wide in exaggerated welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, the incomparable Denzel Washington. Their handshake is brief, professional. Jimmy's grip is too firm, too long, the desperate squeeze of a man trying to establish dominance through flesh contact. Denzel's shake is measured, polite, but his eyes never leave Jimmy's face, reading every micro-expression like a script. They settle into their positions, Jimmy behind his fortress of a desk, Denzel in the guest chair that suddenly feels like a defendant's dock. The audience energy settles into expectant quiet, 300 people leaning forward in unison. So, Jimmy begins, his smile bright as Klieg lights. You've got this new film, Sanctuary. Very intense stuff. Very spiritual. He draws out the last word like it tastes funny in his mouth. Tell us about taking on such heavy material. It's a story about redemption, Denzel replies, his voice steady, measured. About finding hope in hopeless places, about faith as a force for transformation. Right. And you've been doing a lot of these faith-based projects lately. Jimmy leans back, feigning casual interest. Is this part of some personal journey, or just what's selling tickets these days? The question lands like a velvet-wrapped blade. The audience shifts, sensing undercurrents they can't quite identify. Denzel's pause is almost imperceptible, but it's there. A moment where the air itself seems to hold its breath. I make films that matter to me, Denzel says. Stories that need telling. Of course. Jimmy nods sagely, then pivots, with television smoothness. But you've got to admit there's a bit of a formula to these movies, right? Troubled character, rock bottom, spiritual awakening, happy ending. I mean, it's basically the same story with different actors. The studio audience laughs. Not the full-throated roar from before, but nervous titters. Some sense they're witnessing something beyond entertainment, though they can't name what. Denzel's smile is patient, dangerous. Every story of redemption shares common elements, Jimmy. That doesn't make them formulaic, it makes them universal. Fair enough. Jimmy's grin widens, predatory now. But don't you ever want to just have fun? Make something that doesn't require a seminary degree to understand. The words hang in the studio air like smoke. In the wings, Patricia closes her eyes, knowing exactly where this is heading. The battleground has been established. The weapons chosen. Now the real fight begins. Jimmy's eyes gleam with the satisfaction of a hunter who's spotted his prey. He reaches for something beneath his desk, a tablet, preloaded and ready. The studio's massive monitors flicker to life, and Denzel knows, with the cold certainty of a man who's walked into an ambush, that whatever comes next was planned long before he set foot in this building. Now I have to show this clip from Sanctuary, Jimmy says, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm, because our audience needs to see what we're talking about here. The monitor fills with a scene from Denzel's film, but not the scene Denzel would have chosen. It's a moment of raw emotional breakdown, his character falling to his knees in prayer after losing his son to street violence. But they've stripped away the context, the build-up, the earned emotion. Without the preceding 40 minutes of character development, it looks melodramatic, overwrought. The audience watches in confused silence as the scene plays. On screen, Denzel's character cries out to God, his face twisted in anguish, his hands raised toward heaven. It's a moment that in the film represents the shattering of a man's soul. Here, isolated and presented for laughs, it looks like performance art. Jimmy pauses the clip at the exact moment of greatest vulnerability, Denzel's. Character with tears streaming down his face, mouth open in a silent scream of grief. Now that, Jimmy says, pointing at the frozen image, is what I call commitment to the role. I mean, you really went for it there, didn't you? A few audience members laugh uncertainly. Others remain silent, sensing something wrong, but unable to pinpoint what. Denzel sits motionless, his hands resting on his knees, watching his own artistic vulnerability being dissected for entertainment. The thing is, Jimmy continues, building momentum, I watched this scene and I kept thinking, what if someone walked in right at this moment? What would they think was happening? Would they call 911? Would they assume you were having some kind of breakdown? More laughter now, louder, as the audience gives themselves permission to find humor in another man's portrayed suffering. Denzel's voice, when it comes, is quiet, controlled, but carries the weight of controlled fury. That scene represents a father losing his child. It's about the deepest pain a human being can experience. Oh, absolutely, Jimmy agrees, nodding vigorously. Very deep, very painful, very loud. He mimics the crying expression, earning another wave of laughs. And there it is, the moment crystallizes with brutal clarity. This isn't promotion. This isn't even entertainment. This is assassination by 1,000 cuts, performed live for an audience that doesn't understand they're watching an execution. Denzel leans forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Jimmy's face. When he speaks, his voice carries the authority of a man who has just reached his limit. You think this is funny? It's not a question. The studio air grows thick, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Jimmy's smile falters for just A split second, a hairline crack in his television-perfect facade, but he recovers quickly, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness. "Hey, come on," Jimmy says, his voice bright with manufactured innocence. "We're just having some fun here. The audience loves seeing behind the curtain, right, folks?" A smattering of applause, but it's uncertain, scattered. The crowd senses something, shifting, the comfortable rhythm of late-night entertainment lurching off its rails. Denzel doesn't acknowledge the audience. His focus remains laser-locked on Jimmy, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of mountains moving. "That scene took 18 takes to get right," he says, each word measured, deliberate. 18 times I had to find that father's pain, live in it, breathe it. You just turned it into a punchline." In the control booth, the director's voice cracks through headsets. "Stay tight on both of them. This is good television." But the floor producer beside Jimmy's desk shifts nervously, sensing this is spiraling beyond their control. Jimmy tries to deflect, gesturing broadly to the frozen image still displayed on the monitors. "Look, Denzel, I respect the craft, I really do. But you've got to admit, taken out of context, it's a little..." "Stop." The word cuts through Jimmy's rambling like a blade. Denzel rises from his chair, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the inexorable certainty of a man who has reached his decision. Standing, he commands the stage in a way that no lighting designer could have planned. "You want to talk about context?" Denzel's voice is quiet now, but it carries to every corner of the studio. The context is a community destroyed by violence. The context is children dying in streets while the world looks away. The context is faith, as the only thing standing between hope and despair. He steps closer to the audience, and they feel the full force of his presence, his decades of commanding stages and screens focused into this single moment. "I've spent 40 years in this business, and I've watched it forget what it means to honor the human experience, to treat people's stories with dignity, to understand that some things are sacred." Jimmy remains seated, suddenly looking very small behind his desk. "Denzel, I think you're taking this a little too seriously, and I think you're not taking it seriously enough." Denzel steps closer to the desk, his presence filling the space between them. 7 years I spent on this film. 7 years talking to real fathers who lost real children. You think their pain is entertainment?" The audience sits in stunned silence. This isn't the Denzel Washington they expected, the charming movie star with practiced anecdotes. This is something raw, more dangerous. This is a man defending something sacred. Jimmy glances toward the floor producer, a silent plea for rescue. But the producer is frozen, caught between television protocol and the reality that they're witnessing something unprecedented. Denzel leans forward, his hands resting on Jimmy's desk, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carries more authority than any shout. "You want a show, Jimmy? Then let's have one." The band kicks in with jarring suddenness. Their upbeat commercial break jingle a grotesque counterpoint to the tension crackling across the stage. Red lights flash in the control booth. They're off the air for exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The audience sits frozen, unsure whether to clap, leave, or simply witness whatever comes next. Jimmy springs from his chair the moment they're clear, his television smile evaporating like morning mist. He moves around the desk toward Denzel, hands spread in a gesture that might be conciliation or condescension. With Jimmy, it's hard to tell the difference. "Okay, look," Jimmy says, his voice dropping to what he probably thinks is a reasonable tone. "I get that you're passionate about this project. That's great. But we've got a show to do here, and frankly, you're coming across a little intense." The floor producer hovers nearby, clipboard pressed against his chest like armor, his eyes darting between the two men and the countdown clock. 2 minutes, 15 seconds. In the wings, Patricia stands rigid, her hands clenched, watching her friend navigate hostile territory. Denzel hasn't moved from his position near the desk. If anything, he seems to have settled deeper into his stance, like a tree growing roots. "Intense," he repeats, the word carrying a dangerous quiet. "Yeah, intense, heavy. Look, I respect the art, I really do, but this is late-night television. People tune in to unwind, to laugh. They don't want a sociology lecture." Jimmy gestures toward the audience. many of whom are checking their phones, texting friends about what they're witnessing. You've got to give them what they expect. And what do they expect? Jimmy's confidence returns, bolstered by his home field advantage, his years of controlling this exact space. They expect Denzel Washington, the movie star. Charming stories. About Hollywood. Maybe a funny anecdote about working with other actors. Light stuff, entertainment. Entertainment. Denzel says the word like he's tasting poison. 1 minute 45 seconds. Exactly. And right now you're being... Jimmy pauses, searching for the right word, the diplomatic phrase that will reset this interview back to manageable territory. You're being a little too real, you know. Too serious. This isn't 60 Minutes. The floor producer glances at his watch, then at the control booth, then back at the two men locked in their Cold War. 30 seconds until they're live again, and the temperature on stage has dropped to Arctic levels. Denzel finally moves, stepping closer to Jimmy, close enough that the host has to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. Too real, Denzel says softly. For television. Jimmy nods, missing every warning sign. Exactly. So when we come back, let's just dial it back a notch, okay? The red lights stop flashing. They're live in 5, 4, 3. Denzel's smile is sharp as winter. Steel, no. The studio lights blaze back to life, and Jimmy slides behind his desk with the fluid confidence of a man who believes he's regained control. The audience settles, phones still recording, sensing they're about to witness something extraordinary. The countdown reaches 0 and they're live to millions. And we're back with Denzel Washington, Jimmy announces, his television smile perfectly calibrated. Now, before the break, we were talking about your new film, and I thought it might be fun to try a little experiment. Denzel remains standing, his posture unchanged, but something in his eyes shifts, a storm system building pressure. Jimmy gestures to the monitors, which flicker back to life, showing the prayer scene from earlier, frozen at that moment of raw vulnerability. So we've got this very dramatic scene here, and I was thinking, what if we tried to make it a little more accessible to our audience? The floor producer's face goes white. This wasn't in the rundown. I call this segment Prayers for Dummies, Jimmy continues, his voice bright with manufactured enthusiasm. The idea is, we take these very serious religious moments and make them more relatable for everyday people. A few audience members laugh, nervously. Others sit in stunned silence, instinctively sensing they're witnessing something cross a line. Jimmy stands, moving to center stage with theatrical flourish. So Denzel, what I'd love is for you to recreate this scene, but maybe dial down the intensity. Make it more like how regular people pray. You know, less Shakespeare, more sitcom. The words hit Denzel like physical blows. His 7 years of work, his conversations with grieving fathers, his exploration of faith as humanity's last refuge, reduced to prayers for dummies. For a moment, the studio holds its breath. Even the band seems to sense the gravity of what's happening. Jimmy waits, arms spread wide, expecting compliance, expecting Denzel to play along with the desecration of everything he holds sacred. Denzel's voice, when it comes, starts as a whisper, but builds like approaching thunder. You want me to mock a father's prayer for his dead son? Well, not mock exactly. You want me to turn grief into comedy. Jimmy's smile begins to crack. Denzel, it's just, you want me to take the most sacred moment in my film and make it a punchline for your audience. The studio goes dead quiet. The audience realizes they're no longer watching late-night television. They're watching a reckoning. Denzel steps forward, and when he speaks again, his voice carries the authority of prophets and the fury of righteous angels. No, the word echoes through the studio like a gunshot, and everything that follows will be consequence. Denzel moves to center stage, and the shift is seismic. No longer the polite guest enduring an interview, he has become something else entirely, a force of nature commandeering the space. The studio lights seem to bend toward him, and 300 audience members lean forward as one, sensing they're about to witness something unprecedented. Jimmy scrambles to regain control, moving toward his desk, gesturing frantically. Okay. Denzel, I think we should... No. Denzel's voice cuts through Jimmy's babbling like a sword through silk. You've had your turn. Now it's mine. The floor producer steps forward, but Patricia emerges from the wings, her expression fierce, stopping him with a single look. In the control booth, the director screams into his headset, but the cameras keep rolling because this is television gold, even if it's destroying everything in its path. Denzel turns to face the audience directly, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of Sunday sermons and Shakespeare stages, of every role he's ever inhabited and every truth he's ever discovered. You want to know what's wrong with entertainment today? His gaze sweeps across the crowd, making eye contact with individuals, making this personal. It's this, right here, the belief that nothing is sacred, that everything, every human experience, every moment of genuine emotion, every prayer whispered in darkness is material for your amusement. Jimmy tries again, his voice shrill. Look, this is getting a little out of hand. Denzel doesn't even glance at him. That scene you wanted me to mock, that father's prayer, I know that man. I know. Dozens like him. They're not characters in my film, they're real people living with real loss. And you think their pain is funny. The audience is dead silent now. Phones forgotten. Completely absorbed in this moment of raw truth being delivered in their manufactured palace of entertainment. Faith isn't a punchline, Denzel continues, his voice rising, carrying to every corner of the studio. Grief isn't a comedy bit. Art isn't a dancing bear for your circus. And respect isn't something you can take a commercial break from. He steps closer to the audience, and they feel the full force of his presence, his decades of commanding stages and screens focused into this single moment. I've spent 40 years in this business, and I've watched it forget what it means to honor the human experience, to treat people's stories with dignity, to understand that some things are sacred. Jimmy stands frozen behind his desk, realizing he's no longer hosting a show. He's trapped in a masterclass being delivered by a master. Denzel's voice drops to a whisper that somehow carries more power than any shout. Tonight you wanted a show, this is my show now. In the control booth, chaos reigns. The director shouts contradictory orders, while executives huddle around monitors, watching their carefully crafted late-night formula implode in real time. Ratings are spiking through the roof, but this is uncharted territory. A guest has seized control of the entire enterprise. Jimmy makes one desperate attempt to salvage his authority, clapping his hands sharply like a teacher calling an unruly classroom to order. Okay, this has been fascinating, but we need to... What? Denzel turns slowly, his gaze fixing on Jimmy with the precision of a sniper's scope. Get back to your script, your little comedy bits, your prayers for dummies. The host's face flushes crimson. Behind him, the floor producer whispers frantically into his headset, while two security guards hover at the stage's edge, uncertain whether intervening would make things better or catastrophically worse. This is my show, Jimmy stammers, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. I have a job to do here. Your job, Denzel says, stepping closer, is to interview people. Not humiliate them, not mock their life's work, not turn sacred moments into punchlines for your audience. Jimmy glances desperately toward the wings, seeking rescue, but finds only Patricia watching with something approaching pride burning in her eyes. 23 years of managing Denzel's career, and she's never seen him more magnificent. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot, Jimmy tries, his television polish cracking like cheap paint. Why don't we start over, talk about the film? Properly, Denzel laughs, a sound devoid of humor, rich with contempt. Now you want to talk about the film properly, after prayers for dummies, after turning a father's grief into comedy. The audience sits mesmerized, watching a masterclass in the systematic destruction of manufactured authority. Some are recording on phones, but most have forgotten technology exists, absorbed in this moment of raw truth being delivered in their temple of artifice. Jimmy tries once more, his voice rising to near hysteria. You can't just take over my show. This is live television, there are rules. Whose rules? Denzel's voice carries the authority of mountains, of deep waters, of things that endure while temporary constructions crumble. The same rules that said mocking prayer was entertainment. The same rules that turned art into circus acts. The security guards exchange glances, then look toward Patricia, who shakes her head almost imperceptibly. They step back, unwilling, to lay hands on a legend, especially one who's done nothing but speak truth. Jimmy stands behind his desk, suddenly looking very small, very young, very exposed. His kingdom of lights and cameras and manufactured laughter reduced to props in someone else's drama. Denzel surveys the scene, the panicked producers, the transfixed audience, the humbled host, and nods once, satisfied. "Now," he says quietly, "we understand each other." The silence stretches like a held breath. Denzel stands center stage, having delivered his verdict on an industry that forgot its soul, while Jimmy remains frozen behind his desk like a defendant awaiting sentencing. The audience sits transfixed, phones recording but forgotten, witnessing something that transcends entertainment and enters the realm of cultural reckoning. Then the spell breaks. The floor producer, finally gathering courage from desperation, signals the security guards with sharp, urgent gestures. The two men in black suits step forward, their movements careful, respectful, but determined. "Sir," the lead guard says, his voice deferential but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the stage." Denzel turns to face them, and for a moment the guards hesitate. They're looking at a legend, a man who's commanded respect across 4 decades, who's portrayed heroes and villains with equal conviction. But orders are orders, and television must return to its scheduled programming. "Of course," Denzel says, simply, his voice carrying no anger, no resistance. He's made his point, delivered his message, and transformed a promotional appearance into a masterclass in dignity. "I was finished anyway." He adjusts his jacket, that same charcoal grey that now seems like armor, and begins walking toward the wings. But this isn't a retreat. This is a processional, deliberate and unhurried, the walk of a man who has achieved exactly what he came to do, even if he hadn't known it when he arrived. The audience begins to applaud, tentatively at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that drowns out the band's confused attempt at exit music. They're applauding not the movie star, but the man who reminded them that some things remain sacred in a world determined to mock everything. Patricia emerges from the wings to meet him, her face radiant with pride. Behind her, crew members step aside, their usual chatter replaced by something approaching reverence. They've just witnessed a masterclass in moral authority, and they know it. "Ready?" Patricia asks quietly as Denzel reaches her. "I've been ready for 40 years, he replies, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a job completed. Jimmy, finally finding his voice, calls out desperately from behind his desk, "Denzel, maybe we could do this again sometime, talk about the film?" Denzel pauses at the stage entrance, turning back once to survey the scene. The panicked producers, the subdued host, the transfixed audience still applauding. "When," he speaks, his voice carries to every corner of the studio. "When you're ready to treat people's stories with respect," he says, "call me." Then he disappears into the corridor, leaving behind a studio forever changed, a host permanently humbled, and an audience that will never again mistake entertainment for wisdom. The cameras keep rolling, but the real show is over. Within minutes, the internet explodes. The hashtag Denzel vs Kimmel trends worldwide, climbing past celebrity breakups and political scandals to dominate every platform. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire, the moment Denzel said no to Prayers for Dummies, his impromptu sermon on sacred versus profane, his dignified exit while the audience rose in thunderous applause. In the Jimmy Kimmel live studio, the aftermath resembles a war zone. Producers huddle in emergency meetings, while Jimmy sits alone at his desk, still processing what just happened. The audience files out in animated clusters, phones buzzing with messages from friends who watched the live stream. Many linger, reluctant, to leave the site of something historic. Across Hollywood, reaction is swift and divided. On Twitter, celebrities choose sides with the brutal efficiency of a digital civil war. Some defend Jimmy as just doing his job, while others praise Denzel's stand. But the conversation has shifted beyond entertainment gossip into something deeper, a reckoning with an industry that's forgotten how to honor human experience. A veteran entertainment reporter, watching the clips for the 5th time, finally understands what she witnessed. This wasn't about one interview going wrong, she tells her producer. This was about the moment someone said enough. Someone reminded us that not everything is content. In his hotel suite, Denzel sits with Patricia, watching the chaos unfold on muted televisions. His phone buzzes constantly. Reporters, colleagues, studio executives, but he ignores them all. He said what needed saying. Any regrets? Patricia asks. Denzel considers this, watching Jimmy's humbled face freeze-framed on CNN. About which part? Standing up for the work? Refusing to mock people's? Faith treating art like it matters? You know what I mean, none. His voice carries the same quiet authority that commanded the stage hours earlier. Someone had to draw the line. By morning, the conversation has evolved beyond celebrity gossip into cultural commentary. Think pieces multiply across every platform. The death of sacred space in entertainment. When dignity meets digital age, Denzel's stand, a moment that changed Hollywood. Young filmmakers share the clips as inspiration. Theology professors use them in classes about faith in public discourse. Acting schools study the confrontation as an example of authentic presence versus manufactured personality. Jimmy returns. To his show 3 nights later, visibly changed. His monologue is subdued, his interviews more respectful. He never mentions Denzel directly, but the ghost of that night haunts every segment. And in Compton, in Detroit, in every community where fathers grieve lost children, Denzel's words echo. Some things are sacred. His film, initially dismissed by critics as heavy-handed, finds new audiences hungry for stories that honor rather than exploit human pain. The ripples spread far beyond Hollywood, touching anyone who's ever watched their deepest experiences, reduced to punchlines. One man's refusal to compromise became a reminder that dignity isn't negotiable, that respect must be earned, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply, no.